Hi there, and welcome to our autumn webinar series where we're looking at recent developments in the world of employment law. My name's Adam Rice. I'm one of the Knowledge Counsel and the employment team at Travers Smith, and with me today is Laetitia Ajimal. Well, Laetitia, there's been a real flurry of recent announcements on employment law, so we thought we'd sort of take stock of where we are on everything. And so today we're planning to cover the fallout from the mini-budget, recent developments on strike laws and fire and rehire. We'll also take a look at the proposed reforms of EU law and what that might mean for employment law. And then we'll take a look at some proposals on workers' rights more generally. So quite a lot in all of that. Where do you think we should start?
Yeah, quite a lot. So let's start with the mini budget, which obviously caused quite a stir. Many of our viewers will know that the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has already issued an announcement reversing a lot of changes in that mini budget. In fact, we've actually already had to re-record this webinar once already because things have been moving so quickly. So where are we at with the various proposals from the mini budget?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the headline proposal coming out of the mini budget for employers was around the off-payroll working rules. And the proposal was that the rules would be repealed from April next year. But Jeremy Hunt, the new Chancellor, has come in and said, no, that's not going to happen. The rules are going to remain in place as they are. So no change to the off-payroll working rules for now.
And those are the rules that were introduced in 2017 for the public sector and then just last year for the private sector.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And just to recap, these are the rules that say where you engage a consultant or a contractor and they supply their services via a personal services company or a limited company, then you need to assess their employment status for tax purposes. And what that means is if you took away the personal services company, would they be an employee for tax purposes? And if the answer to that is yes, you need to account for tax and national insurance as though they were an employee.
Okay, so given that those rules aren't changing, now's probably a good time to take stock and review internal processes and procedures to do with
payroll rules. I agree. I think given we know the rules are staying in place, it's a good time for employers to go back and make sure they're complying with the rules, they've implemented them correctly. And one of the key things under the rules is issuing status determinations, your assessment of a contractor's employment status. And they need to be kept under review. So it's a good time for employers to go back and look at status determinations which have already been issued to make sure that nothing has changed in the relationship. And also to have a process looking forward to make sure that any changes in the relationship are picked up in future.
Good idea. So where are we at with the other proposals from the mini budget then?
Yeah, so one of the other proposals was around bankers' bonuses, you might remember. So at the moment, there's a cap on bankers' bonuses. So certain employees working for banks and building societies and large investment firms, employers have to limit the bonus payments to these employees to 100% of salary. So you can't have a bonus which is higher than that at the moment. The government said as part of the mini budget that it would scrap this cap. And as far as we know, that is going ahead.
There have also been some developments on strike laws, is that right? I suppose that's going to be topical given the recent transportation strikes over the last few weeks.
Yeah, quite a few interesting developments on strike laws recently, actually. So back in July, the government introduced a law which lifted the ban on supplying agency workers during strikes. So previously it was unlawful for an agency to supply agency workers to cover the work of striking employees. But that ban has now been lifted. So employers can engage agency workers where you've got employees on strike, and that's quite helpful. But the big but with that is there has been a challenge brought. So Unison and various other trade unions have, supported by the Trade Union Congress, brought a legal challenge saying that the ban should be reintroduced because it fundamentally undermines the right to strike if you let employers bring in agency workers to provide cover.
Okay, so one to wait and see how that pans out then.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Of course, one of the other things that came up in the mini budget is the government proposed to introduce a new rule that would require trade unions to put pay offers to workers before they balloted for industrial action. And I think that would be quite helpful. We often see employers negotiating pay arrangements with the trade union. The employer puts forward an offer and the union says, that's insulting, we're not even going to put that to our members, we're going to ballot for industrial action. But this rule would mean that where the employer puts forward a meaningful pay offer, that would have to go to workers before the union could ballot for industrial action, or that industrial action would be unlawful.
And there have also been some announcements about minimum staffing levels in the transportation sector.
Yes, that's right. In fact, the government has actually put forward some draft legislation that would introduce minimum staffing levels in the transport sector. And broadly what this means is that where there's a strike on the tubes or the rail network, a certain minimum number of employees would have to turn up to work. So you have a certain minimum number of services running, and that's just to avoid the disruption to commuters. So that legislation is making its way through Parliament now, and that will be a great relief to lots of commuters, I imagine.
Yeah, so lots of developments on strike laws to keep an eye out for then.
Now, on the same theme of collective consultation and collective negotiation, one thing we've seen a lot of in the press in recent years is this tactic of fire and rehire. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, so fire and rehire is a tactic sometimes used by employers in order to change terms and conditions. So sometimes where the employer can't get the employee to agree to the changes that they want, they will terminate the existing contract and they'll offer them new terms, hence the term fire and rehire. This has come under a lot of criticism recently. In particular, earlier this year, there was the P&O ferries redundancies. That wasn't actually a case of fire and rehire, but it caused a lot of scrutiny about these types of practices more generally. So to the point where even the government has been called to ban the practice altogether.
Okay, so do you think that's likely to happen? Are we going to get legislation on this?
Well, the government's actually said that they're not going to ban that practice, but they are going to introduce a code of practice. So that would kind of set out when and how you can use fire and rehire. There hasn't been a commitment to a specific time frame, but it was brought up quite recently. And the government has said that it should be introduced in the near future. So it's something that we should definitely be keeping an eye out for, because employers will need to make sure that they comply with the code when it comes in. And if they don't, they could face an uplift in compensation in any relevant claims. It's worth noting that ACAS has actually already published guidance which says that fire and rehire should only be used as a last resort. So I suppose fire and rehire hasn't actually changed. The law hasn't changed currently, but it could become a lot more prescriptive when that code of practice is introduced. A lot of employers are already thinking twice before using it, given, clearly there are going to be reputational concerns. So it's always going to be important to consider all of the options and do what you can to get the employees to agree to the changes in their terms before resorting to fire and rehire.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible. And I guess in the meantime, employers look out for this code of practice, which is coming anytime soon.
Exactly, yeah. And I mean, while we're on the theme of worker rights, there has been a lot of talk about potential review and potentially revocation of some EU laws. So that's causing quite a stir. How do you think that might play out in terms of employment law?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, I think, and also quite difficult to predict what's going to happen. So the government has actually tabled draft legislation, which would mean that all regulations derived from EU law would automatically expire at the end of next year, so the 31st of December 2023. So all those regulations would just come straight off the statute books. That is unless the government decides to do something with them, so either keep them as they are or keep them in an amended form. Yeah. And of course, a lot of UK employment law is based on EU law. So this could potentially cover a lot of employment laws that we're very used to dealing with. So things like TUPE, it would also cover the agency worker regulations, and it would also cover the working time regulations, which set minimum statutory holiday entitlements and also the maximum working week of 48 hours.
that all sounds like it could be quite drastic then, doesn't
Yes.
it?
Yeah, well, it could be, but we don't know for sure. So the first point worth making here is that this legislation is in draft at the moment. It's got to make its way through Parliament, and the passage through Parliament is by no means certain. We have to wait and see. And then the second point is that the government hasn't actually said what it's going to do with all of these employment laws that are based on EU law. What's been suggested is that there would be a process of review. So over the course of 2023, the government will review all EU-derived regulations and then decide what it wants to do with them. But of course, there's been a lot in the press about how much regulation there is that's actually derived from EU laws, and the government seems to be finding new regulations each day. So that seems a bit ambitious, I think, to get that all done by the end of next year. And there is the possibility to extend this deadline to the end of 2026. And there's some suggestion that the government will do that. They'll push the deadline back a bit.
Okay, so it'll be interesting to see how that one develops then.
Absolutely. Shall we come on then to some more recent announcements around employment law and other areas that might be in store? It seems that Rishi Sunak is quite keen to get back to the 2019 election manifesto for the Conservative Party. So what changes were promised there? What might we see from this government?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we were expecting an employment bill earlier this year, but that didn't eventuate. So some of those proposals that were initially made under the employment bill have now kind of started to resurface under individual pieces of legislation. Yes.
And one of those was around protection for parents, wasn't it, facing redundancy?
Yeah, that's right. So currently, if you make someone that's on maternity leave redundant, or if you put them at risk of redundancy, there's a requirement to offer them suitable alternative roles if there is one available. Now, the proposal from the government is that any employee who's on maternity leave would have that protection from the point where they notify the employer that they're going to be taking maternity leave up to 6 months after they return from the maternity leave. And as I said, that there hasn't been any kind of update on the employment bill, so that's actually been taken forward as a separate piece of legislation, and the government has announced recently that it will be backing that legislation. So we could be seeing that change coming around, sooner rather than later, probably next year.
Okay, so likely that it will actually come into force.
Yeah, exactly, and that would actually also apply to adoption leave and shared parental leave, but we need to know kind of the details of the legislation to know how that's going to work in practice.
It's a similar position, isn't it, with carers leave? Yeah. So the government's proposed this new right to carers leave. That was also in the 2019 election manifesto, was supposed to be in the employment bill, but there's been a separate carers leave bill tabled in Parliament, and the government recently announced that they were going to back that as well. So this would introduce a new right to up to a week's of unpaid leave each year for employees who are carers. And so employees could take that leave to care for a dependent or relative who's got sort of long-term care needs.
Yeah, and in terms of other changes in the employment bill, one of the key areas was around flexible working. So the government said that it would try and aim to make flexible working the default position, which sounds like quite a grandiose statement, but in reality, what they proposed was effectively just tweaking the right to make a flexible working request. So it didn't apply from 6 months of continuous service. It applied from day one of employment. So the employer would still have the right to reject a flexible working request where there's a good business reason for doing that. There's been less movement on that one, so we don't know if or when the government plans to bring that around. Some of the other changes we were expecting were around casual and 0 hours workers. So that there was talk of making it a right for 0 hours workers to ask for a more stable contract. So what that would mean was if a 0 hours worker was working, for example, 20 hours a week every week, they could ask to be on a 20-hour contract instead of a 0 hours contract. And that would kind of operate in a similar way to a flexible working request, in the sense that the employer could still reject that request as long as there was a good business reason for doing that.
Okay, and do we know if the government's taking this forward or when they're going to take it forward?
So that's also not currently clear, but it is worth mentioning that there have been some other protections that have been brought about for 0 hours workers. So a few years ago, there was already a ban on exclusivity clauses in 0 hours workers' contracts. And that has also now been recently extended, or there's been regulations introduced that mean from the 5th of December, that will be extended for low pay workers. So that's anyone earning below the lower earnings limit. So some developments there.
Yeah, anything else then for vulnerable workers?
It is worth mentioning that a few years ago, the government had a consultation on casual and 0 hours workers and whether or not they should actually be getting compensation if a shift is cancelled last minute, without reasonable notice. We don't have the outcome of that consultation yet. We don't know how the government's going to respond, but they have recently said that they will be responding in due course. So that's still on their agenda.
That famous phrase, in due course, yes. So another one to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose that's quite a lot to think about. Are there any other key areas that you think that should be on people's radar?
But I think the other big topics to keep an eye on are really cultural issues around the organisation. So things like diversity, whistleblowing or speak up, and investigations. I think they would be my top three. And it just so happens that they are also the topics of the final webinars in this series. So do stay tuned for those. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us. We hope to see you next time.
Thank you.